Welcome, everybody, to Philosophy 2231, Philosophical Classics on Ethics and Political Philosophy. This is Lecture 1 of the course. This class will focus on three major works in philosophy, focusing centrally on ethics and tangentially on political philosophy. Those three works are going to be Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Mill's Utilitarianism, and Immanuel Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. Each of these works is integral to the core of a contemporary understanding of the humanities, in particular philosophy and philosophy of ethics, and particularly the Western sort of liberal arts tradition as a whole. All three contribute to the debate at the core of what may be considered the most important philosophical question or set of questions that we do and may ask as humans. In this class, we will study three particularly important views of morality held by three influential thinkers, one ancient, Aristotle, and two more recent, Kant and Mill. The important question of this class is, what should I do? Or maybe more clearly, what is the right thing to do? The study of morality itself is what the discipline of ethics in philosophy attempts within the larger subject matter. Philosophy studies the most general subject matters. It is the most general of subject matters and asks the most general of questions. Subdivisions of philosophy include metaphysics, which asks what exists, what is there, what things are made of, how things are related. Epistemology asks what we know, if anything, and how we know it, how it is that things outside of us can come to be known through our perceptual faculties or through reason. And ethics asks what we should do, what I should do, what is right to do versus what is wrong to do, and answers why. It also deals with questions of how we should live together, how we ought to treat one another, how we ought to treat the planet, how we ought to treat inanimate objects, ourselves, animals, and so on. Ethics deals with normative questions of what should be or what ought to be, what right and wrong is, good and bad, just and unjust. There really are innumerable theories of what determines what is right from what is wrong. Um, Again, though, in this class, we will be focusing on three in particular. But to begin with today, it's going to be helpful to situate the kinds of answers we will be looking at by getting a couple of further theories out of the way, other theories of morality that you might be inclined towards holding already. The two theories worth looking at are commonly held today around the world, and they are almost certainly familiar to you. It's likely that many students already subscribe to one or the other of these two views, especially if you haven't taken a class in philosophical ethics before. Both of these views should seem familiar, but both will suffer in a certain fundamental way. The two different common views that should be familiar to you can be divided into two different sorts of theories. One of which suggests that morality comes from or depends in some way upon religious truth or religion in general, or maybe upon God's will or the nature of God. While the other suggests that morality is really just some kind of social practice, where the rightness and or wrongness of a view or of a particular action is relative to a particular individual, group, or society. Here I'm going to start off by talking about the idea of morality that's based in religion, and then move on to discussing societal relativism. Many take their religious commitments to be tied essentially to their commitments to the good, right? So if you're religious, regardless of the religion that you're a part of, you are admonished generally to do good, to do the right thing, to not sin, to live a life worth living in the eyes of God. Often there are some set of rules based in religion, derived from some sacred text or tradition, right? Things such as do not murder, do not lust or covet, do not lie, love your neighbor as yourself, right? Each of these rules tells us in one way or another how it is that we ought to live. But for each rule, we can ask why. Why should I not murder? Why should I not lie? Why do I need to love my neighbor as I love myself? And on the religious view of morality, the answer comes in some way like this. It's because God tells us to or not to. He either commands us to do something or forbids us from doing something. And that's the reason behind why the thing is considered to be right or wrong. It's due to the commandment of God. Now, for those already initiated into a particular religion, this response might be adequate, right? God says so, God is in charge, and so there's no need to question further why it is that we're supposed to act in the ways that God commands us to act. But suppose you're uninitiated or a philosopher, and so you are looking for reasons, you're looking for justification behind the scenes. You're asking the questions of why. Why should we do what it is that God commands us to do? Why should we follow these rules? What is it like? What rule says that we have to do what God tells us to do? The philosophical theory behind this religious view is one that is often called divine command theory, or DCT for short. DCT, divine command theory, states that an action is right only if it's commanded by God, and wrong if God forbids it. Right? So if God says, love your neighbor, then you must do so in order to act rightly. And if God says, do not murder, then you must not murder, or you will have done something wrong. This sort of explanation of the rightness and wrongness of actions should feel familiar, at least to anyone that has had any kind of interaction with religion or religious believers. But the theory itself is open to questioning along the lines of one of the most famous dilemmas in all of moral reasoning. This dilemma is called the Euthyphro dilemma, or Euthyphro's dilemma, and comes from a famous dialogue of Plato, who was the teacher of Aristotle, one of the authors that we will be reading in the next few weeks. In this dialogue, the question gets asked: why does God command us to do what God commands us to do? And the follow-up question is, does God command us to do what He commands us to do because what He commands us to do is right, or are we to take the action as the right one to do merely because God has commanded it? This creates the dilemma that if there's no reason for God behind the scenes to have commanded the thing that he's commanding, it seems that morality ends up being arbitrarily dependent upon God's will, where God doesn't actually have a reason to give or on offer for why he's commanded what he's commanded. Whereas, on the other hand, if God does have a reason for commanding that which he's commanded, then it doesn't seem that God himself commanding that action is the basis on which we should think of that action as right or wrong. Another way of seeing this dilemma is by asking whether God has a reason for telling us not to murder, steal, or harm one another, or whether these actions are only morally wrong because God has commanded us not to do them. What is it that makes an action right or wrong? Is it, as the divine command theory claims, that God has merely said so? Or does God have a further reason for treating those actions in particular in the way that he does. Herein again lies the dilemma. Either God lacks a reason for thinking particular actions are right or wrong, and so the actions are right or wrong only because God commanded them to be that way. But in that case, it seems that morality becomes somewhat arbitrary, arbitrarily dependent upon God's will. And while, of course, it makes sense to say that God is all good, that becomes kind of an empty claim. If goodness is determined merely upon the basis of what God says is good, then there's no further backing up. There's no further explanation to be had. If there's something beyond which God's goodness can be sort of, you know, taken, like we can judge it on the basis of, we can say here's the reasons that God is good, or here's the reason that God makes these commandments because they are good, then we have a further reason, a reason on which God might actually give for his commandments, right? If God does have a reason for commanding the particular actions that he commands, and then that's the reason why those are the right ones, then this further reason is the reason that those actions themselves are right and wrong, not merely the fact that God commanded it. So basically, if there's no reason for which God commands the thing, it seems somewhat arbitrary, and rightness and wrongness is merely dependent upon the fact that God commanded something. But if God has a reason for his commandments, it seems that the morality of the activity that God is commanding isn't dependent upon God's commanding it, right? It's dependent upon something else, something underlying, some underlying reason why the action itself is good or bad, right or wrong. The problem on the second horn of this dilemma is that many religious devotees wish to believe that God is the origin of all things, including all of morality. That God created the world and determines how we should act and what we should do. But if it's only up to God what we should do or not do, then God has no reasons for commanding what he does. Those reasons are just his. They're just willy-nilly. They're just um, according to whatever he feels or how he thinks, right? Like, we don't really fully understand God. I think that's part of the point. But that just doesn't seem right. God, the all-knowing creator of the world, if such a God exists, would seemingly have good reasons, if not the best reasons, for everything that he does or she does. So commanding or forbidding a particular action should be something that she has a good reason for. But if God has a good reason for it, this reason must be in some way apart from God, right? It must be something other than God, something already set, some necessary truth about the nature of reality itself, about the nature of morality itself, about the nature of things as they are, and what makes it the case that certain actions should be done and other actions shouldn't be done. And that is what determines what is right and wrong, thereby giving God the reason for his commands. It's not as if God says, don't harm one another, merely because, and that's what makes not harming one another right or wrong. It's something about the nature of harm itself and the fact that harming someone is a bad thing insofar as it affects the person or does something wrong to the person. And the idea here is that the reason that God would command not to harm others is because the harm is detrimental in some way, shape, or form, and so problematic. And so the basic idea here is really just, look, either God has to have a reason, or the morality of the situation is in some way, shape, or form empty. Some of you may be religious and may be unsatisfied with this mode of reasoning so far, and that is good. There is a lot to unpack here. We could teach an entire lecture or multiple lectures on divine command theory and the Euthyphro dilemma. But one thing that's worth pointing out about divine command theory is that it leaves those uninitiated into the religion itself already wanting. If I ask why I should not murder, and you respond because God says not to, I seem justified in following up with my question, well, why should I act in the ways that God commands? Here we run into a block. The religious person cannot simply respond that God commands you to do what he commands you to do, right? Like that, as if that's a reason why I should do what God commands. It's not that like right, I'm already asking why or on what authority God has the right to command me to do anything in the first place. Um, if there's no reason beyond what he commands, right? That's just the way it is. Then we're in a standstill. We're in a place where no further productive debate can be had. The religious person begs you to accept that you should do as God commands because he commands it without reason. The non religious person says they need a reason to follow God's commands. So there has to, here in some way, shape, or form, be something, some further reason to do the things that God commands beyond, like, that explains why it is that what God commands is the right thing to do, right? And that reason, that kind of explanation, is the kind of thing that we're looking for here. That is missing from the divine command theory. It's part of what makes it seem arbitrary to say that we should do the things that God commands merely because God commands them. Um, there needs to be something further backing up the explanation that God would give, hopefully, if God were asked, well, why should I not hit my brother on the head? Right? Why should I not torture puppies for fun? Why should I not, perform infant sacrifice? Right? These kinds of things that are morally problematic, morally wrong. There needs to be something beyond the bottom being because I have commanded thus, right? Um, and that's part of the reasoning here. It can't just be that because it's the religious tradition or because God says so is the final word. Even if it is the final word with respect to the religion, there's got to be some philosophical underpinning, some further explanation, some further understanding that can be had to try and determine what it is that makes these things right or wrong. As a kind of hint here, the three theories that we're going to be looking at for the rest of the course attempt to answer just such questions underlying. Like, they try to give a justification for why we should do or not do the particular things that are right or the things that are wrong, right? They offer reasons available even to God, right? To try and justify particular actions that we usually see as right or wrong, right? To justify the just actions and say we should do those, and to say that the wrong actions are unjustified and that we should try to avoid those. Another common theory concerning morality, one that many of you may be inclined towards, is called relativism or cultural relativism. The contemporary form of this view comes mainly out of the academic study of anthropology over the last century and a half. As we've studied the numerous cultures that have existed on the planet for the last few thousand years and come to this sort of post-colonial era, we've come to see that vastly different cultural practices and cultural treatments, in particular of particular activities, counting as right or wrong, right? Different activities according to different cultures. For one culture might count some particular activity as something that ought to be done, while another one might count that particular activity as something unholy and to be cast into the flames or something like that. Take, for instance, the ancient practice of cremation. To many cultures, many cultures thought that the burning of the dead was the best way to send them off into the afterlife, to sort of set the spirit free from the body, or something like that. Um, and yet, some cultures took this practice to be morally atrocious. They saw the burning of the dead as destruction of the body, and they thought of that as a terrible thing. Because, maybe their culture believed in some form of reincarnation or some form of resurrection of the body. And if you have a pile of ash, it's a lot harder to resurrect or reincarnate that kind of body. Um, More extreme cases, you might think of like something like cannibalism of the dead. So in some ancient cultures, it was thought that eating the dead helped to give you their power. And so you would eat your enemies or your leaders when they died in order to gain their wisdom and power in battle or in leadership or something like that. Now, we now, of course, see this practice, cannibalism and not cremation, as confused. But we do want to but we don't. Well, but do we want to condemn the societies for doing something morally wrong for cannibalizing the dead? I mean, like the practice that they followed then was a part of their religion or a part of their metaphysics. It was a part of their view of how the world actually worked, right? In a sense, we might say that they acted in the right way relative to their own culture. While it might be wrong or gross relative to our contemporary culture to think about eating the dead, who are we to say that what they did was morally wrong, right? What gives our society the right to claim that their society was doing something morally incorrect? This kind of reasoning gets at the core of cultural relativism. It takes the what is true for me or us is different from what is true for you or them approach. It claims that the existence of differences in cultural practices determines that there must not actually be any set of right or wrong practices, sort of on the whole. The rightness or wrongness of a particular practice is determined by the culture itself. And so you may be allowed to sort of get away with spitting on sidewalks here in California, say, but if you go to Singapore and you spit on the sidewalk, they'll arrest you, right? Different places, different cultures have different rules about what is right and about what is wrong. And while cultural relativism or other forms of the view can be tempting, the problems that come with the view are plentiful. Many of the ideas presented here are rooted in an epistemic claim. We are stuck within the perspective of our own culture. So, of course, we think cannibalism is wrong. However, how can we be sure our culture is right about this? We can't get outside of our own culture. But the claim that follows seems unjustified on the basis of this merely epistemic claim. Therefore, there cannot be any objectively correct practices outside of those relative to one's culture. There cannot be some outside standard for which a culture's practices can be judged moral or immoral. This claim seems to be easily challenged. There are a number of cultural values that it seems all cultures kind of have. Some form of cooperation, some kind of an attempt to avoid hunger and suffering, the ability to cooperate in raising children that we need in order to continue on. All of these kinds of values seemingly must be undergirded by some kind of collective moral unity that is derived from our shared humanity itself, and not merely from our cultural or societal norms and practices. Cultural relativism makes it impossible for societies to criticize one another for being objectively wrong. Something like slavery, racism, genocide must be seen only in the light of being wrong by our own lights, but not necessarily by the societies that had them. That would mean that criticizing the Nazi Party for the Holocaust, while clearly wrong from our perspective, was not objectively wrong, as it was the right action for them to take given their own societal views. Take contemporary practices like female genital mutilation, ancient practices like religious infant sacrifice, or not even that long ago, the practices of raping and pillaging neighboring tribes or cities after winning battles as the spoils of war. Is it really defensible to say that there is nothing objectively wrong with these activities? Nothing that can be pointed to beyond merely the fact that they are accepted or rejected relative to various cultural standards in different cultures. The cultural relativist view suffers from a problem similar to that of the religious view of morality. The relativist view says that at bottom, no actions are ultimately right or wrong in a vacuum. They are only right or wrong relative to a culture that has a practice. Remove the practice, remove the morality or moral judgments concerning the practice. However, all practices come with reasons. There are always explanations, justifications, and supposed facts that lie behind or underneath the practices themselves, meant to explain how they came to be and why it is that they ought to be continued. In fact, many of those practices that we see as horrific today have explanations that directly relate to the values that we all have as humans. Take the ritual sacrifice of animals or children or virgins in order to appease the gods, right? The attempt here was always in sacrificing something to try and stop some pestilence or to bring about some bounty that could supposedly be caused by the gods. The reason for the sacrifice was to create safety, to maximize the protections of the rest of the community, or to help the community avoid suffering and gain a good harvest. Many, if not all, practices that we point to now as wrong, um, that happened in the past, have underlying explanations that anchor them in to genuine moral principles, core moral principles that we do all share. It's just that these practices either go too far. The means of achieving the ends attempted by these practices are too atrocious or unjustified, or the practice itself is based on some kind of factual misunderstanding of how things in the world actually work. Take the instance of bloodletting in medicine, that which happened up until the last couple of centuries. Um, the idea was you bleed out a patient in order to get the illness out of them. Seemed like a smart idea, but in the end, it was actually more deadly than helpful. The thought process was good, and the attempt at helping people was good, but the actual means to get there ended up being more detrimental than helpful. The same kind of thing seems to be going for many of the previous cultural practices that we see now. We better understand the world, and so we better understand that you don't need to sacrifice, virgins in the volcano or children, in infant sacrifice. Like, you don't need to appease the gods in these ways in order to live safe lives. Divine command theory and cultural relativism begin from very different places, but they ultimately face similar philosophical problems. The divine command theory grounds morality in the commands or will of God. An action is right because God commands it. It's wrong because God forbids it. Relativism grounds morality in the practices or standards of particular cultures and societies. In both cases, morality is tied up to an authority outside of the particular individual, the commands of God in one case, and the accepted cultural practices in another. Yet, once we begin asking why that authority should determine what it is that's right and wrong, both theories have difficulty providing any further response, any further justification. The problem with divine command theory becomes especially clear through Euthyphro's dilemma. If God commands an action simply because God chooses to command it, then morality begins to look arbitrary. God could seemingly have commanded something different. But if God commands an action because there's already a good reason why that action is right, then that reason, not merely God's command, appears to explain its moral status. Either way, the philosophical question remains: we want to know not simply who commands an action, but what reason there is for thinking that action ought to be performed. Simply responding that God commands it eventually produces a standstill when someone asks why God's commands should have moral authority. Relativism encounters a similar difficulty. A culture may accept a practice and may therefore regard that practice as right, but we can still ask whether the culture has good reasons for accepting the practice. If cultural acceptance alone makes something morally right, then there seems to be no standpoint from which practices such as slavery, genocide, or other forms of serious harm can be criticized as objectively wrong. More importantly, cultural practices themselves usually have explanations and justifications that undergird them. Once we examine those reasons, we have moved beyond merely asking what a culture happens to accept and towards the deeper philosophical questions of whether the reasons supporting those practices are actually good ones. The theories of Aristotle, Mill, and Kant that we will study throughout the rest of this course can be understood as attempts to go further precisely at this point. Instead of grounding morality simply in what God commands or what society accepts, each philosopher attempts to provide a philosophical account of what certain ways of acting are right or wrong, or why certain ways of acting are right or wrong. They therefore return us to this fundamental question with which we began: what should I do, or what is the right thing to do? But they recognize that an adequate answer cannot simply consist of another rule or command. We also need an explanation of what makes the rule justified and why a rational person should accept that justification. Aristotle, Mill, and Kant will offer importantly different answers to that question. Aristotle directs our attention to what it means to be a human being and to live well, and what kinds of character or virtuous activity allow for a human life to flourish. Where Mill asks us to consider the consequences of our actions, and especially the relationship that stands between the consequences of different actions and their bearing on the happiness and suffering of individuals. Kant, however, will approach morality from reason itself, asking what principles of rational agent could consistently recognize as binding and thus see as applying universally. Their theories disagree substantially about where moral justification ultimately comes from, but each theory attempts to identify something deeper than the mere fact that an authority has issued a command or that a community somehow happens to follow a particular practice. And so each of these theories offers an answer that is deeper than the divine command theory or the cultural relativist theory. This is therefore the larger transition from our opening discussion into the central project of this course. Divine command theory and relativism help to expose the question that a philosophical theory of ethics must answer: what ultimately gives us reason to do one thing rather than another? Aristotle, Mill, and Kant each attempt to supply that missing justification. rather than ending the conversation with God says so or culture says so, or that that is simply what we do. They attempt instead to explain what there is about human beings, happiness, rationality, or morality itself that gives us reasons for action. The task going forward will be to understand each of those answers and then ask whether any of them can successfully explain not only what we ought to do, but why we ought to do it.